Hello and welcome to this online lesson. My name is Mr. Hoven, and today we're going to be looking at the progressive reforms of the late 1800s. We're going to be looking at individuals, specifically the muckrakers, who used the pen or writing to expose the corruption in the government, in the big businesses, and other social problems. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, there was a large call for reform in the late 1800s. Many Americans believed that the government was no longer serving them, and they were allowing big business to run amok. These individuals had many different goals. They were known as progressives, who focused on urban problems, government, and big business. They claimed that the government was taking advantage of people instead of serving them. So they believed that it was their duty to call for change. So one of the ways that these individuals sought to help control big business, because if we remember, big businesses under laissez-faire had total control of their own industries. No government intervention meant long working hours for the individuals who worked in the factories, little pay, very dangerous conditions, and sometimes even the American people who were using the products that were produced were becoming injured, sick, or even dying. So many Americans believe that trusts or groups of companies had too much control over the economy and government. This concern led to new laws regulating big businesses. And in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law which would control trusts and monopolies. However, during the 1890s, the government rarely used this act. Instead, it applied the act to labor unions as a way to keep them under control. The government claimed that labor strikes hurt trade. And it was not until the early 1900s that the Sherman Act was used to win cases against trusts. And another industry that needed to be reined in was the railroads. The railroads formed an oligopoly, a few large companies that controlled prices for an entire industry. So now if you're going to ship anything or if you're going to travel using the rail lines, they set the prices and there's no competition at all. So again, without competition, they can set them much higher than they would if they didn't have any. So reformers called for rules on railroad rates. And in 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which required railroads to charge, and publish reasonable and just rates. So it meant rates that were reasonable for people to travel and that were not unjustified. The act set up the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, to oversee the railroads and later trucking industries. Now, there was some difference between the groups of individuals that came forward for reform in this time period. The socialists believed the government should own and operate resources and major industries on behalf of the people. So government has complete control, total opposite of laissez-faire. Getting rid of it. Don't need it anymore. It ain't no good no more. Wow, that was great English. Way to go, Mr. Hoven. Eugene V. Debs found the Socialist Party in 1898. But we also had the progressives, who wanted the government to regulate industry rather than own it. So again, the business owners would still, under a progressive idea, still have some control, although they'd be regulated by the government. They believed that society had a duty to protect and help all its members, especially those without wealth or power. So think, who would be some of the groups that didn't have wealth or power? Possibly immigrants, factory workers, and people who are living in the cities. So one way to show that there were many problems with America that needed to be changed was going to the pen or publishing articles. And journalists aided the reformers. Investigative reporters wrote newspaper and magazine stories that alerted people about all of these problems. These people were called muckrakers, journalists who wrote newspaper stories and magazine articles about the problems in society. These reporters racked or exposed the muck, the dirt, the corruption underlying society in order to eradicate it and make society better for all. Now, some of these well-known muckrakers, one was Ida Tarbell, who described the oil trust's unfair practices. So she really went after J.D. Rockefeller and his oil trust and exposed him for how bad it really was for all the people involved, especially the consumers. And Jacob Riis, that name should sound familiar. He exposed the terrible living conditions in the slums and tenements, leading to housing reform. But one individual in particular who is very well known, and we're going to be looking at him and his work in class, is Upton Sinclair. In 1906, Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle described the horrors of the Chicago meatpacking industry. In response, Congress passed the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. As a result, food and medicine had to be accurately labeled with all of its ingredients, and bad food could no longer be sold. Again, we've got some individuals really working to change society in this time period. That about wraps things up for today. When we see you again next time, we'll be talking about women's suffrage and the Prohibition Act or movement. We'll see you next time.